Hi guys, Mr. Benson here. This week we're going to be talking about natural selection and evolutionary change. So our lesson is central questions. How does natural selection provide a mechanism for evolution? Is natural selection random? And what is the cause of adaptation? So before we get started, I should talk about some terms that'll make a little more sense as we go. The word species, you're going to hear this word a lot as we go. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed with each other, that can produce fertile offspring. A species is the smallest unit of classification that we have in biology, and it's a grouping of organisms that has this particular quality. Population are all of the members of one species that live in an area. There can be multiple populations of a species in a region that could be separated from each other geographically or through some other means. Genetic variation is a difference in traits within a species. Genetic variation happens because of sexual reproduction. It's one of the things that happens as a result of that particular process. So we talked about evolution very briefly last week, and evolution is, at the end of the day, a change in allele frequencies in a population over time. It's not an animal changing into another animal, it's a population changing over a gradual period of time. Charles Darwin is a scientist who proposed the idea of evolution, but it's not unique to him, and it was kind of stirring around before him. But Charles Darwin published a book called On the Origin of Species that proposed a mechanism for evolution. So how does evolution happen? He called this process natural selection, and natural selection is what we simulated last week with our peppered moths. He came to this conclusion after exploring some islands off the coast of South America called the Galapagos, and he made some discoveries along the way, and he made some observations that helped him come to this conclusion. The most important thing that Darwin proposed is that successful traits spread through a population, because those that do not have those traits will be less reproductively successful. They will have less babies, essentially. And so if you have fewer kids, then there are less of your alleles, less of your genes in a population. And so if your genes change in a population over time, then the allele frequency changes over time, and that's called evolution. So there are four major things here that contribute to natural selection. There's variation, competition, overproduction of offspring, and fitness. So these are four concepts that Darwin put forward that he noticed in the Galapagos. So the first thing is, if you look at these shells here, you can see that species are inherently varied. Just within a population, there's a lot of variation. No two individuals look exactly the same, and this is due to what happens during meiosis, during sexual reproduction, and this is also due to mutations that occur in the genetic code of these kinds of organisms. So populations are inherently varied. Variation is inheritable, right? So you can inherit traits from your parents if they're genetic, if they inherited them from their parents, or it's a mutation that occurred to their gametes. So variation is able to be passed down, and so this is important for this concept here. Another important concept that Darwin pointed out is that resources are limited. There's no such thing as unlimited food. So organisms compete for those limited resources. Whether it's mates or food or space or anything like that, if there's a limited amount of it, organisms have to compete for those resources. Another thing that he noticed is that organisms tend to have more babies than necessary. They will have a high reproductive potential. If you look at these mice at the bottom here, you could imagine that most of these would not survive to reproductive age. Maybe predators will eat them, or they die from disease or things like this. Having more children than you need is something that organisms do to ensure that their species continues to survive. But another thing to consider here is that because of this, populations remain at a constant size. So even if predators come along or there's not enough food, your species will continue to thrive despite this fact. Because some of the members of your litter will have fitness, right? They'll be able to survive in that environment. So some traits can be beneficial in certain situations. So natural selection, one thing I want you to realize is that natural selection is situational. We think about our peppered moths, it depends on the environment, right? The environment determines what traits you have. If we were looking at pre-industrial revolution moths, most of those peppered moths were grayish or white. Post-industrial, most of those moths were black, and it's because the environment changed, the situation determined what that population looked like. So if you have a beneficial trait that helps you survive, it's called an adaptation. Some adaptations are mutations, some adaptations were inherent variation that were already present that just happened to be beneficial when the environment changed. So an adaptation is a beneficial variation in a population. So adaptations are a response to environmental pressures. So a changing tree color would be an environmental pressure, or the type of predators, how those predators hunt. So if the predators that we're hunting are peppered moths use a sense of smell rather than sight to find those moths, then they would probably not look the same as they did in reality. So one last thing to cover here is adaptations are a response to environmental change. And at the end of the day, natural selection is a response to environmental changes. So selection is dependent on the environment. If the environmental conditions change, then selective pressures can change, things that choose which traits are fit or not fit for an environment. Natural selection is not random. Remember, it's dependent on the environment. It's not just random mutations being beneficial or not. The nature is deciding what is beneficial or not beneficial in these situations. If you have traits that are not beneficial and adaptations don't arise in your population, then you go extinct. And if you do have traits that are beneficial, and depending on the scenario, you may see something called a speciation event. You might see a new species arise. If a population is broken up somehow, if a population is separated, let's say a mountain range rises up and it breaks apart a herd of deer, for instance, into two separate populations. Over time, genetic differences are going to build up in those two different populations to the point where they can no longer interbreed. We now have two new species. Remember that definition for species that we have. And that's evolution, right? Really what Darwin was talking about is not how life began, but how new species arise. One of the common misconceptions people have about evolution is that it's about the origin of life. Really, it's about the origin of species. And that's what Darwin named his book. Species can occur within one species, but it can occur across many groups of species as well. Like, for instance, Darwin observed birds in the Galapagos, and he noticed that many of them had several different types of beaks. And each of those beaks was adapted for a specific type of food that was found within the Galapagos. The Galapagos are a pretty barren, arid place. It's tough to live there. There's not a lot of food resources available. And so this was a very strong selective pressure for different kinds of beaks. Populations evolve. That's another important thing to remember here, not individuals. So no one single animal decides, well, I'm a horse and I can't reach those fruits up in those trees there, so I'm going to grow my neck out really long and become a giraffe. That's not a thing that happens. And if that is something that you think evolution is, then you have to dispel that in your mind, because it's a misconception that is very, very common. So one last thing here is natural selection is heritable, right? Acquired traits can be passed down. Acquired traits are not heritable. So things like if you were to kind of stretch your neck out, like surgically get implanted, I don't know, fake vertebrae or something, you would not be able to pass those traits to your kids. Or if you get a scar or a tattoo, acquired traits, ones that you get during your lifespan, are not things that you can pass on to your children. The only kinds of traits that you can pass down are genetic traits, right? Heritable traits. And again, natural selection is not random. It's determined by the environment. Nature is the one that's choosing here. So environmental factors matter, and environmental factors are variable as well. Reproductive success determines whether or not those traits become more popular in a population or not. So if you live longer, you have more kids, and if you have more kids, then more of your genes are in the population. And that's how natural selection works at the end of the day. So before we finish off, I just want to define some things here that will be helpful next week. So there are some things outside of natural selection that can cause populations to change, like genetic drift, for instance. When we talked about that population of deer that was separated by a mountain range, we could have those two populations of deer with the same environment, but there's just a mountain separating that population, and they will still gather up genetic differences over time, because these alleles that are spreading throughout a population or being lost over time can randomly appear or be lost just to random circumstances. And this can cause genetic drift to occur. Genetic drift is a random loss of alleles in a population, which means that you slowly see differences even if there's no major environmental change. Mutations are one of the things that contribute to this as well. Mutations can add new traits or new alleles, at least. Non-random mating is when organisms choose mates based on some kind of characteristic that they prefer. Classic example is birds, right? Well, a lot of birds don't have to worry about predators necessarily, so they get to choose the characteristics that they want. And that's not necessarily nature, it's the species itself that's deciding what traits they prefer. Migration, and particularly in animals that migrate as a part of their lifestyle, like there's huge migrating herds of water buffalo that will travel across an entire continent in search of water. And these groups can interact with each other over time, and this can cause allele frequencies to change as well. So, what did we learn today? We learned how natural selection provides a mechanism for evolution. Natural selection results from selective pressures in the environment and is not random. We also learned that there are other processes like genetic drift that can cause the equilibrium of a population to change. And only natural selection results in adaptation, not things like making a decision to change. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'm not sure which direction the buttons are here, but yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.